Hello, my name is Sandra Jamieson, and I'm speaking to you from the United States where I teach. I apologize that I'm recording this in advance, and I also apologize that I'm recording it in English. I hope to be present for the question and answer after this session if the internet permits, but in the meantime, if you use the QR code at the bottom of the screen or the tiny URLs, you can download both this presentation or the notes that I'm about to speak from, and those notes are in both English and Spanish. So if you download those, scroll to the second half and you will see them beautifully translated. So I hope that you can follow along and that it's not too inconvenient to have to use the translation. So one of the things I love about this research is that I have the opportunity to learn how other countries deal with issues of plagiarism and intertextual practices, and how scholars think about and teach students to think about the complicated relationship between writers and their sources. So I'm excited for this conference, even though I can't be there in person. I'm also always fascinated by the ways those in the field of literature and philosophy in particular balance the theoretical work of Julia Kristeva and Mikhail Bakhtin with the kinds of plagiarism policies we have to live by. I want to start with a brief reminder of the intertextuality that Kristeva said emerges from textual systems. Louise Rosenblatt describes the creation of these textual systems as a creative transaction, a coming together of a human being with all that implies of past and present preoccupations, and a text with all that implies for potentialities for participation. I want to begin here to remind us that in the rest of our academic lives, we grapple with difficult ideas we don't always understand or translate accurately. Yet when we think about student writing, we all too frequently reduce these complex textual systems to an obsession with citations and plagiarism, with the human being rather than with the text. Academic integrity is no small issue, of course, but something is lost when we only consider that aspect of student writing. You may catch a glimpse of Kristeva and Bakhtin dancing below the surface of this text, along with a little Foucault and other less experienced guests. The question of originality is constantly challenged by interruptions from the ideas that have gone before, and that's what I want to talk about today. First, I'd like to start the discussion with the intention of my title. When intentionality isn't plagiarism, what is it? And why does this matter? Key to my question and the ways I propose we think about intertextuality in its simple and complex forms are the words when, what, and why. And these terms structure my presentation. To start with my first word, when. When is intertextuality plagiarism? Sometimes, when an author takes the words and ideas of others and passes them off as her own, the resulting text meets the standard definition of plagiarism. But how many words and ideas can an author take? If a paper is totally written by someone else, or is a patchwork of copied paragraphs with little or no contribution from the person claiming to be the author, we're on safe ground to say the student cheated by plagiarizing. But what about when an author copies some exact words without the use of quotation marks and surrounds them with her own words? How many copied words make this qualify as plagiarism? And how much does the intention of the writer play a role in this determination? Disciplinary committees face these questions regularly, and no matter how clear the academic integrity policy is, the final adjudication too often comes down to a subjective judgment. And that is too often based on untrained people thinking they can determine a person's intention based on their testimony. This is not in any way a criticism of the people who organize and serve on such committees. Indeed, I do so myself. However, we're all influenced by our beliefs and expectations, no matter how hard we try to rise above them. Because of what is known in psychology as the halo effect, people who seem ethical and good are more likely to be considered innocent, and people who we are already predisposed not to trust are more likely to be considered guilty. This occurs in any situations where a judgment is called for, but it has some serious implications for the teaching of writing and for adjudication of academic integrity violations. Jennifer Mott Smith cites research showing that in the US at least, inadequate attribution is more likely to be overlooked in, quote, papers written by students who are members of a powerful group. She says that's people of a privileged race, native speakers of the dominant language, or those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Because of their status, these people are assumed to have integrity. This is not because adjudicators are afraid to call them out, but because they really believe that members of these groups are better. She concludes that charges of plagiarism may be more about social inequity than individual deceit. Studies of US student writing, such as those by the Citation Project, find data that appears to take this finding one step further. Here is a graph showing the frequency with which researchers found different uses of source material in student papers. I'll talk more about that research in a minute, but first, look at the yellow bar. That is what researchers term patch writing, a mix of copied and slightly altered words that most institutions classify as plagiarism. The researchers documented the use of patch writing in over half of the papers they studied. If every student who incorporated some words without adequate citation was accused of plagiarism, these numbers suggest that our classrooms will be very empty. So not only are disciplinary committees apparently making subjective judgments about who is guilty of plagiarism, instructors appear to be making decisions about who to report based on a similar set of assumptions. Students whose writing is less sophisticated are easy to catch, and they're also assumed to be more likely to be guilty. The research I'm referencing here, conducted by the Citation Project, looked at student research writing from 16 very different universities located across the US, coding the types of sources students selected and the ways they drew from and cited those sources in their papers. We collected the papers and randomly selected 174, 800 pages of prose. Then we identified the sources used in those 174 papers, a total of 930, found those sources, compared the original text with the way the students incorporated it in 1,911 citations. Citation Project researchers were most interested in how students took the words of the source text and incorporated them into their own texts. And we coded the terms summary, paraphrase, quotation, copy, and patch writing. Here are the definitions we used. I put the definition for patch writing in Spanish so that if you're trying to follow along, you can see it. These were definitions that were written for coders. So you'll see it's very specific instructions, such as asking them to count things. This is not the definition I would use if I was teaching a class. All of them, though, were adapted from textbooks designed to teach students how they should use sources. You'll see the coding colors at the top. I'll be showing you some example papers in a minute with that coding in place. Because the students knew we were researching and had the opportunity to withdraw from the study before submitting their paper at the end of the semester, it seems safe to think that those who had intentionally misused sources would not have shared their work. Subsequent research confirmed that students who submitted patch-written papers were not aware that they had violated any rules, even when the copying was extensive. So let me transition now to my next question. What is intertextuality if it isn't plagiarism? It can be paraphrase. It should be paraphrase, but it can also be patch writing, which I and many others identify as failed paraphrase. Here is what these source uses look like. The first is an example of paraphrase. Don't worry if you can't read it. Look at the colored words. Words highlighted in yellow appear in the student text and in the source text, which the student cites. Close examination shows that the students changed the order of the sentences and the information. More important, though, is that the student is using this information to make a point that is different from that in the source text. As such, the student is creating a relationship between existing ideas and information and the new ideas in the source text, transforming those ideas and creating a textual system, albeit very rudimentary. The paragraph may be dull, but the writing and thinking processes we see emerging every time a student attempts a paraphrase is exciting. In contrast, this is an example of patch writing. This kind of source misuse goes by many names, but the definition seems pretty stable. To incorporate into one's own sentences words and ideas that are copied exactly or almost exactly from a source, even if that source is cited. Once again, don't worry about translation, just look at the words that are highlighted in yellow. These are copied from the source and appear in the student paper in the same order and in support of the same point as that of the source. As you can see, the source text is one sentence, which the student renders into two, working through the original sentence word by word and repeating most of the words and ideas. Undoubtedly, the student thought that she was paraphrasing the source, which writers are encouraged to do to explain the ideas in the source or draw attention to specific phrases or details. The student may be on the way to creating a textual system, but there is as yet no evidence of that in this paragraph. There is no student voice there. This should be no surprise. Putting one or two sentences into one's own words is incredibly difficult, and the resulting prose almost always pushes out the student voice. I don't actually know how to paraphrase this passage without repeating the words and ideas. Yet, as German scholar Deborah Weber-Wolf puts it, simply changing words around or inserting or deleting a phrase does not result in original work, but an edited work. And based on that description, she concludes that texts like this one are still plagiarism. She notes that this kind of plagiarism, among many others that she lists, might be treated differently than other kinds, but still, it clearly falls under the definition of plagiarism. And that is also why it's called plagiarism in most university policies. I, though, beg to differ with Weber-Wolf. By talking about intention, we work ourselves into an awkward corner. Our academic integrity policies clearly say that all plagiarism is cheating. Sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not, but it's always cheating, even if the author did not know she was doing it. That logic works when you're, say, talking about driving above the speed limit, where one can look at the speedometer to confirm one's speed, but if one doesn't, one is still speeding. But it doesn't work for plagiarism, because there's no easy gauge reminding us to slow down. No other form of academic cheating is identified as possibly accidental. Cheating, by definition, is intentional and is often treated as an ethical issue. Is it possible to be unintentionally unethical? I think not. So I would argue that when there is an intention to deceive, such as wholly copied or ghostwritten papers, we might use the term plagiarism instead of cheating. But I also argue that it is not cheating if the student didn't intend to deceive. A student struggling to understand a complex source that contains language or terminology that the student doesn't normally use is quite likely to repeat some of these words and may lack the confidence to rearrange them. In that case, the intention is to represent the ideas in the source, which is signaled by a citation. The intention is to create the kind of dialogue between sources so prized by academics, a textual system. But the result is that the writer's voice is subsumed by the sources, both because the words of the source have more authority and because those words dominate. The students are pushed into the kind of deference that makes the academic conversation impossible. But by what logic would we argue that the student is unethical? Too frequently, patch writing is so far from intentional that students don't even recognize when they've done it, even when they read over a paper once it's complete. Here are two examples I use to support this claim. First, look at this paper. Again, don't worry about reading it. The highlighting tells the story. Text highlighted in green is paraphrased. Text in yellow is patch written. Pink is summary and blue is quotation. You can see the student slipping in and out of paraphrase, sometimes getting it into her own words and sometimes sticking too close to the text. Like the student in the previous example, this student moves through the source text sentence by sentence, and lacking any distance is unlikely to be able to make the connections between words and ideas that are necessary for paraphrase or summary. But you can see that there's more than one source here. The student is taking three sources in one paragraph and trying to put them into conversation. Unfortunately, she slips into paraphrase, from paraphrase into patch writing and back again, actually quite smoothly. Too frequently, students, especially first year and transfer students, do not really understand what is permitted and what is not. In a smaller study, I asked 120 students to look at some descriptions of source use and review some examples and tell me whether they believed the examples to be plagiarism. In the example in slide 18, in question 18, there is no source cited. It's circled in red. And the student text includes 2 incidences of patch writing in yellow and 1 of direct copy in blue, in this case without quotation marks. Of the 113 students who responded to this question, 87 said it would be in violation of the campus academic policy. This would seem to indicate that about 3/4 of the students knew a problematic text when they saw one. However, the next question, question 19, sheds light on their thinking. The only difference between the example in question 18 and the one in question 19 is the addition of that citation. Now, only 42 students found it problematic. A total of 63% said this example would not be considered a violation of their campus academic policy. As you can see from the yellow and blue text, the student who wrote the example only contributed 4 words and copied the rest, repurposing the bulleted list in the source to prose and slightly changing the order to make it flow more smoothly. But with the addition of the citation, almost 2/3 of the students who responded did not find this method to be problematic. If they did this themselves, they would be unintentionally plagiarizing. They would be doing what they thought was correct, as long as it included a citation. So the answer to the first question is, when the reproduction of extended passages of source texts without modification, citation, or quotation marks can be classified as plagiarism, the person who does that in their writing can reasonably be accused of cheating. The key word here is extended. I would identify that as whole papers or entire papers or passages, large passages, but not sentences like these in this example. So when is it not plagiarism? A text that incorporates the words and ideas of a cited source text into some kind of relationship with the words of the writer, however clumsily, should not be classified as plagiarism. The writer may have been aware that they were taking a submissive position to the text, and they may have been aware that they were unable to rephrase the ideas, but the struggle is visible in that incorporation, and classifying this as an ethical breach as plagiarism just makes no sense. So what if it is not plagiarism? I would argue that the examples I have shown are examples of a failure of reading and or writing. They are not an ethical failure. Nor are they intentional, as we generally think of the term. They evidence the first step toward creating the kind of textual systems Kristeva describes. And so we get to my last question. Why does this matter? For one thing, the fact that instructors cannot agree on where to draw the line between a failure of ethics and a failure of paraphrase leads to unequal justice and to potential harm to those already disadvantaged by the larger systems in which we live. But beyond that, it also blinds us to the ways we might teach students to trace and create the kinds of intertextual practices that make scholarship generative rather than simply imitative. And that failure of instruction extends beyond the undergraduate level, as research by Service and Pecorari have shown. It is not learned at the undergraduate level. If it isn't learned at the undergraduate level, is it fair to expect graduate students to have significantly more developed skills? If instructors and institutions assume that students already know what they're supposed to do when they engage with sources and just need to learn how to create reference lists and in-text citations correctly, then that's all we're going to teach. Similarly, if we assume that students know the difference between paraphrase and plagiarism, we will also assume that misuse of sources is intentional. And so, as many recommend, institutions will provide instructions in ethics rather than writing, and invest not in teachers, but in expensive software that they hope will catch transgressors. Exhorting students to be honest is not the same as teaching them the incredibly complex process of intertextuality as described by Kristeva, or more simply by textbooks that present source-based writing as a conversation. I want to cite a final US study that I believe could be replicated elsewhere with similar results. Research from Project Information Literacy, Alison Head and Michael Eisenberg reviewed 191 assignments and handouts from 28 US universities to see how they introduced and explained the research and writing process to students. They found that those instructions focused on what they describe as the mechanics of preparing a research assignment. from focusing a topic to research and citation methods. However, they fail to explain what academic research is, why scholars conduct research, or why students are asked to do it. Nor do they explain what research entails as a critical process of inquiry. And yet we expect students to understand that. Study after study reveals a significant disconnect between the way faculty talk about their expectations for research writing and the way students understand it. If we fail to invite novice academic writers into deeper understanding of authorship, information literacy, or reading practices, we can't expect them to produce the rhetorically complex intertextuality that marks the academic writing we value. The first step in this process is to determine what we consider to be acceptable, and then to explain it. The what and the when of this paper. Tasks that seem pointless to students, often presented instrumentally as checklists or flowcharts, are likely to be assigned less effort, which exacerbates the problem. Yet papers produced using this method of quote mining, writing from sources, creating superficial justification, and strings of undigested citations are too often rewarded. They look like academic writing. Most incorporate ideas using at best weak paraphrase or patch writing, but it's only when one reads the sources and then rereads the papers that the problems become apparent. And this is where we get back to Kristeva. In Desire and Language, she describes the creation of textual systems in which texts interact. This is not, says Kristeva, simply a form of intersubjectivity, where writers are struggling to dominate the authors of the sources they cite to establish their own authority. Rather, it is a system in which each text absorbs and transforms the other. As Kristeva explains, writers are readers of the text they cite and of their own text. As readers, they are also writers and interpreters of the ideas of others in the context of their own ideas and previous readings of history and culture that shape their interpretation. It is this complex relationship between writing and reading multiple texts in the context of prior reading and implicit rewriting of new and existing ideas that makes the resulting piece of writing a textual system. As Rosenblatt puts it, this is a creative transaction, a coming together of a human being with all that implies of past and present preoccupations, and a text, with all that implies for potentialities for participation. It's this coming together, this relationship, that counts in the more complex understanding of intertextuality, not how the ideas in the sources are reproduced or cited. The struggle to create a textual system from discrete sources may lead to errors in citation as ideas merge and transform. It may lead to an overdependence on the authority of sources and citations. It frequently ends with a paper that is still more a patchwork of citations than a mosaic. In each case, the writer may not have the time or the ability to go further, and it's this stopping short that challenges us to rethink what we want and expect in student writing. The process of textual interaction is complicated, and I apologize for making someone translate such a dense passage. If this is a new idea to my audience, I think what you need to take away from it is that the process of engaging with texts is complicated. To focus on originality in citation is to utterly miss the point and reduce writing to the mindless search for sources that support an already determined argument. And that also seems a little pointless. On the other hand, the process of engaging with the ideas of others and taking the risk of having one's ideas transformed by them is exciting. If instructors read student texts, looking for the places where they're beginning to make connections between other texts, rather than for the errors and missteps, we come to the real answer to my initial question. Intertextuality, as defined by theorists and philosophers, is a mosaic of the words and ideas of others. Patch writing might be the first step in creating that textual system, and approached in that way, it empowers student writers to engage further with the text they read, rather than cower in fear that their integrity will be challenged. You can see a full list of my references if you go to the paper that's at the end of the QR code right here. And as I said at the beginning, they are available in both English and Spanish. Just scroll down to get the Spanish part. The presentation with subtitles is also available via YouTube, and there will be a link on this slideshow once you download it. So thank you for your time. Gracias. And you can contact me by email if I'm not able to show up for the question and answer session. Thank you.